Speaker.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I rise today in support of public schools. I am a parent, I'm a former middle school teacher, I'm also the child of a working class mom and an immigrant dad. And I understand so deeply that education is the bedrock of this great democracy. But Mr. Speaker, I am worried about our public schools. I'm worried about the news stories about banning books, erasing black curriculum from schools. These Republican actions are not supportive of our public schools, or teachers, or parents, or our students. This assault on public education does not make us a stronger nation, a kinder nation, or a more thoughtful one. We don't have any fear about facing the complexity of our nation's history. Our democracy is stronger than that. It can withstand the ugly details, the inconvenient truths, and the uncomfortable nuance. We have a robust democracy. We have a republic that can face tough questions about its history. We need not be afraid of this. Age-appropriate curriculum about our nation's history must include the hard parts. Our students and our parents and our teachers can handle it. Let's trust them. It's concerning to me that in some districts, we have movements to prevent students from learning about slavery or the Trail of Tears, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Anne Frank. As the grandchild of an immigrant, a man who was killed in the Holocaust, child of an immigrant, grandchild of someone killed in the Holocaust, I know the importance of knowing history. I know the importance of speaking frankly and clearly about what happens when we don't know the details, when we simply demonize a group or dehumanize a group of people. What we need to do is shine the light of day on complex history. And when we use our time here in Congress to fan the flames of culture wars instead of investing in our schools, we are not doing the jobs that we were sent here to do and that parents want us to do. It doesn't matter what your political stripe is or whether you're not involved in politics at all. What you want for your children and your grandchildren is essentially the same. You want a strong education for your kids and grandkids. You want schools where all students feel safe and supported and can be their very best selves. We know that kids, they suffer when they don't have the resources that they need. We should be investing our time and energy into making sure all of our schools, regardless of zip code, have the resources they need for every single American kid to be successful. That's our job. It's at the core of who we are as Americans. It's not banning Judy Blume or trying to pretend that racism was part of our past and indeed, in many instances, is still a part of our present. We should not be afraid of these details. To ensure that the next generation of Americans are equipped for adulthood, we have to support well-rounded, holistic education that sets up our children for success. Now, I have a 13-year-old, almost 13, she'll be 13 in a couple weeks, and a 15-year-old. And I will tell you that every time we sit down to dinner at my house, we have robust conversations about the news. And in fact, my son, when I first started in Congress, I used to walk through the door on Friday afternoons and he'd say, "Mom, let's talk about your votes." and we have complex conversations about geopolitics. And I don't shy away from talking about the hard stuff with my son or my daughter. I trust them to ask the questions of me that are age appropriate. I wish that we could trust our families across this country more to be able to have rich and complex conversations with their students about curriculum that is often complicated. That is the human experience. That is the American experience. It is not tidy. Nor would we want it so. We are a nation of ideas. We wrestle with concepts. This is who we are at our best. We should not be afraid of this happening in our public schools. And I know the impact that quality education can have on our young people, and the danger that lies ahead if we use our positions as elected officials to be prescriptive about what should be discussed in our public schools. The continued attack on our public education, which is often fueled by divisive rhetoric and often, unfortunately, manufactured controversies, is an affront to parents and students everywhere. As I said, they know how to navigate complex issues. Why are we so afraid of this? Our continued dependency within this building of creating groups of people to demonize and dehumanize for political ends, unfortunately, then gets played out in public schools across this country. How is this possibly helping the democracy? I want students to ask hard questions. When I was a teacher, I welcomed them. I welcomed people from across the political spectrum and their parents to be able to come into my classroom and have deep conversations about difference. It's not about indoctrinating people. It's about having a place where we're not afraid to talk about hard things. Isn't that what we want for our schools and for our communities? I fear that we are so afraid of having hard conversations that we've stopped talking at all. Better to shut down any conversation about something that somebody perceives as controversial than to try to come together with differing opinions, wrestle with ideas, wrestle with complexities. This is who we are at our best. This is actually what this body was supposed to be, and what our public schools can be at their best, a microcosm of the democracy. And I know, having been a public school teacher, and I taught middle school, and people often say middle school is a great preparation for being in Congress for a whole lot of reasons, that public school teachers and the parents that support those teachers and those students are some of the most committed, compassionate members of our communities. They are invested in their students. They are committed to their communities. And unfortunately, they have become targets of baseless attacks that have come from divisive politics. And I have to say, the attack on public schools, the attack on teachers, it is not serving us as a nation. It is not, as I said, making us stronger. It is not making us more thoughtful. It is not making us more equipped to deal with the complicated world of geopolitics that we must confront. I welcome hard conversations, and I always have in my classroom. This is what teachers across this country are trying to do: hold space for hard conversations. Why are we so afraid of that? I also have to say, as a woman who has 2 kids, and my spouse is another woman, I want my kids to be able to go to a school where their teacher is not going to be reprimanded for acknowledging that my kids have a particular kind of family. I want my kids to feel like they have as much of a right to be in a classroom, to get an education, than anyone else. Why are we so afraid of difference? For many years in this country, difference, diversity of experience, diversity of background. We talked about our nation as a great melting pot. Sometimes it was called a fruit salad. Sometimes it was called a potpourri of experiences. It used to be that we celebrated that we did not see that as a danger to our very democracy. We are in what I feel like is not just uncharted territory, it is dangerous territory for the Republic. I know from representing Vermont, which is a rural state with hundreds of communities dotted across our wooded landscape, that the public schools are the heart and the soul of our communities. They are where young minds are nurtured, where curiosity is fueled, where community itself is fostered. And our teachers, in conjunction with the parents in those communities, play an invaluable role in shaping our children's future. They deserve to be acknowledged for the work that they do and not vilified. One of the things that I heard as I was campaigning across Vermont to represent my state in Congress, didn't matter what community I was in, people would come up to me at the end of events and say, I don't want to hate my neighbors. I don't want to feel like the only way forward is to be fearful of other Americans, people within my own community. I try to live my life here in Congress and as a former teacher as someone who is always thinking about how do we bring the community of man back together? How do we move away from a meanness of spirit that is not just corroding our work here, but is actually corroding our nation? Schools are an important part of people being able to come together and speak honestly about their experiences and their histories. It is a way forward for us as a nation. Why are we so afraid of having difficult conversations? Now, I never imagined that I would be standing here before you as the child of an immigrant and a working class mom, as a gay woman. I never thought that I would be walking in these halls. But I'm here, I have a place here, and I'm going to use my voice to continue to ask the question, what happened to our ability to have tough conversations without demonizing each other, without dehumanizing each other? We know what happens when norms are upended, when rights are attacked. We have seen this across the globe. We've seen it here in our own country. Public schools are an important part of building back the strength and the vibrancy of our democracy. At this time, I yield to my colleague from Michigan, Representative Tlaib.
Thank you so much for your incredible courage, my good colleague from Vermont. I know I come and grew up in the most beautiful, blackest city in the country, in the city of Detroit, where every corner is a reminder of the civil rights movement, a reminder of different movements that ensured that our black neighbors had human dignity. But now across the country, far-right extremists, elected officials like the governor of Florida are attempting to whitewash black history and ban books in our children's classrooms. Florida's own Board of Education just approved new black history standards, and public school students will be now taught that enslaved black folks benefited from slavery. The audacity. There's no two sides, Mr. Speaker, to slavery. Slavery was cruel, it was inhumane, it was a violent practice that denied our black neighbors and communities their basic human dignity. It had no redeeming qualities. Many of the founding fathers in this chamber even owned human beings themselves. These are just facts. These are our history. You cannot teach the truth about American history without teaching African American history. We must teach our children, Mr. Speaker, the truth about our nation's history. That means reckoning with racism, oppression, and lynching, dehumanization, and white supremacist violence. We cannot learn from our past if our past is no longer being taught. We will not allow anyone to rewrite our history. And again, it is so important that this chamber understands that black history is American history. And again, I cannot thank my good colleague from Vermont, Representative Balint, for really, truly championing this issue today. And again, from a community that taught me oppression against anyone needs to continue to be uplifted and fought against, I can't stand by, even if it's another state doing it, and say that it's okay and stand by idly. I can't stand by the sidelines, and we have to, again, continue to speak truth. With that, I yield back to my colleague.
Thank you, Representative Tlaib. Parents and voters across this country understand the biggest challenges facing America's students in our public schools. And it's not about curriculum that includes details about slavery or the Trail of Tears or Anne Frank. That's not what most voters and parents care about. What they care about, number one, they care about getting students the support they need. And in some instances, that's one-on-one support to meet the needs of their students. They care deeply about addressing the educator shortages that we see across the country. They care deeply about ensuring that their students have the mental health services that they need. And they care deeply about the dangers of gun violence in their schools. They want candidates to address these issues. They want leaders who will address these issues. And I will say, the needs of parents are really not that different from the needs and the desires of students. I've spent quite a bit of time traveling across Vermont, speaking to predominantly middle school and high school students about what it is that they are concerned about. And they talk about the same kinds of things. They talk about needing mental health supports. They talk about how afraid they are to go to school because they're worried about the epidemic of gun violence. They're concerned that they won't be prepared for a future. They are not clamoring to have curriculum restricted. They want to have those hard conversations. In fact, you know, I taught middle school for many years, and I run into some of my former students who are now adults, and we talk about the conversations that we had in my classroom that were on hard issues, but they were age appropriate. I trusted them and their families to be engaged in the work that was happening in my classroom. I fear that where we're headed is a future in which what it is that teachers are allowed to discuss with students will be so restricted that our students will not be prepared for the future outside of their little communities. History is complicated. It is often ugly, sometimes really distasteful. I studied African American history and Native American history when I was earning my master's in history. I studied African American communities post-Reconstruction during an era known as racial uplift. I looked at Black women's community organizations and the work that they did post-Reconstruction to have vital supports within their communities. I studied Native American land claims. And the missteps and mistakes and atrocities that happened in history regarding tribal claims to land. I am a better person for knowing these things. It did not fundamentally make me a less patriotic American. It did not make me less grateful that my father came here as an immigrant to build a new life. Every nation has its complex histories, its difficult chapters, its reckonings. No nation is without dark spots in its past. But where we can rise above as a nation is to say, we will embrace head on the complexity and the nuance and trust our students and our parents and our teachers that they can have those conversations. And it will not make them less likely to love their country. But I will tell you, having taught middle school for a very long time and community college, that students feel betrayed when they are not given age-appropriate curriculum about the hard stuff. And then they find out about it later, and they feel like we have been withholding history from them, that we don't trust them enough to ask the good questions. I wish so sincerely that we would trust parents more across this country to be able to have a relationship with their local public school and their teachers, and together have those meaningful, sometimes difficult conversations. One of the things that I'm also quite concerned about is that we're not investing even in the infrastructure of schools. I'm concerned that there are so many aging buildings across this country that in a decade or two are not going to be structurally sound for our students. It's going to take a big investment of money to make sure that every single student has a safe building to learn inside. But our priorities often in this building are not around investing in the needs of our children and our families. And so I know that bill is going to come due. And there's going to be a time when parents and communities look back and say, why didn't we make those investments when we should have? Is it not true that our children are truly the most precious resource for the nation. Now, the other thing that I've been thinking about is that we, as parents, need to be willing to show up for our schools and our students, even when there is no controversy. Take an interest in what's happening, not because you have any kind of agenda, but just because you want to know what's happening in the schools. I can tell you that most of the schools that I know of in Vermont, they would welcome involvement from the community, whether it is a community garden, whether it is helping to lead after-school programs. What is the most frustrating thing is when people are not involved in the work of the school or what's happening there, and there's a sense of suspicion about what's happening there. And I can tell you, as somebody who volunteered as much as I could at my kids' school when they were little, I knew what was happening in the schools because I was there communicating. Public schools are not the enemy here. Teachers are not the enemy. Nor are trans people and queer people that seem to be on the receiving end right now of a lot of the vitriol around public schools. I went into teaching for one reason: alleviating suffering. That is the same reason why I ran for state senate. It's the same reason why I ran for Congress: alleviating suffering in all of its forms. And when you're a teacher, you have to do that in real time, because kids come into the classroom with whatever they were dealing with that morning at home. And it's the job of the teacher to hold all students where they are and make the classroom environment a place where all feel safe and supported. It's not an easy job, I can tell you. Oftentimes, when you're a teacher, you get to the end of the day and you haven't remembered to eat or use the bathroom or take care of any of your personal needs, because there's only one thing that is important to you, which is making sure your students get what they need when they are with you that day. Can we please stop demonizing teachers? Can we please stop thinking there is some sinister agenda? People serve in that capacity because they want to make a positive difference in the lives of children. And sometimes it's as simple as sitting with a student who had a rough time on the bus in the morning, or someone who is carrying with them a deep insecurity about themselves, and that's getting in the way of their learning. We talk in education about differentiated learning. And we use that to talk about how students come in with different levels of success at a particular topic, particular curriculum, and you try to differentiate it, make it possible for them to be successful. But I've often thought when we talk about differentiated learning, we forget that that's what teachers do day in and day out with every single student they have. What does this student need right now? How can I help them get what they need so they can be successful? It is both exhausting and rewarding. Can we please stop attacking teachers? At this time, I yield to my colleague From Hawaii, Representative Takuda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am definitely out of breath. I ran here for my other hearing because this was just such an important hour that we participate in. Patsy Takemoto Ming is the mother of Title IX. She had a vision and a dream for her daughter and for all of our children to live a life free from the kind of discrimination she suffered as a woman of color. Her groundbreaking advocacy and reforms have since paved the way to allow all of our children to fully participate and engage in their education, in sports, and in all other forms of learning as their true, authentic selves. Removing discrimination and inequity on the basis of sex was personal for Congresswoman Ming. Throughout her pursuit of higher education, she faced racial discrimination, segregation, and limited opportunities simply because she was a woman. Many of us serving here in Congress on both sides of the aisle are here because of Patsy's perseverance and courage, and I am humbled to serve in the seat that she held with such grit and such grace. Like Patsy, I see every action or inaction we take here in Congress through the lens of a mother. While we cowardly delay action on gun legislation, I leave home each week terrified that one day an active shooter drill at my son's school might not be a drill at all. As we fight book bans and the perverse culture wars of the far right, I wonder how will my boys feel when they see less and less of themselves in what is represented as history and in the books that are on the library shelves. While we watch as bullies in Congress try to push our loved ones back into the closet through guilt and shame, I hug my babies, now teenagers, every single chance I get, and I remind them, as I have since they were little, of my unconditional love for them and my only wish for them to be whomever they seek to be. As we fight in this chamber, kicking and screaming against what is nothing less than a movement to use our children as a means to institutionalize racism, legitimize discrimination, and oppressed marginalized people and communities of color around our country, I often sit and ask myself, what would Patsy say? What would Patsy say? I cannot speak for this great tower of a woman, but I know in my heart that she would not stand for this kind of politicization of our children. She would stand shoulder to shoulder with all of us and say, hell no, not today, not today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Representative Takuda. Mr. Speaker, we have important work to do in this country. We need to continue to invest in schools so that we can reduce poverty. We need to alleviate hunger. We need to work together to build better outcomes for kids. We need to give teachers a living wage and create equitable systems that don't leave anyone behind. Your zip code should not determine whether you get a robust, rich education or not. Students, parents, educators deserve more. They need partners, not partisans. They don't need bullies. What they need is for us to stand up for robust, rich education and not be afraid to talk about the tough stuff. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.